memory of my former husband, Charlie Sellers, and we are going to commemorate his life here. I just want to say a few things about Charlie to start with. He was born on September 9th, 1923 in Charlotte, North Carolina. And he then taught at the University of California, Berkeley. But before that, he attended Harvard University. He was an undergraduate in history and literature. And then he served in the ski troops at Camp Hale in Colorado during World War II. He unfortunately fell and twisted his knee, so he did not get to go overseas with the others, and many of those were killed by the Nazis in Italy. So he was saved by his knee. He graduated from Harvard in 1947. He was in the class of 45, but because of the war and service, it was delayed until 47. He graduated magna cum laude. He received a PhD in American history from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in 1950. And then, from 1958 to 1990, he taught here at the University of California at Berkeley. He's the author of several books, which are on display. He's the author of a 2-volume biography of President James K. Polk, and volume 2 of that won the Bancroft Prize in American History, which is the highest award you can receive, in 1967. And then he also is the author of Market Revolution, Jacksonian America, 1815 to 1846, which was published by Oxford University Press. In 1964, he was a visiting professor at El Colegio de Mexico, and in 1970 was the Harmsworth visiting professor at Oxford University in the UK. A major symposium on his work was held in London in 1995, resulting in a book titled Market Revolution in America, which was edited by Nolan Stokes and Stephen Conway. So I would now like to announce Steve Sellers, who will come up and sing the North Carolina State Anthem.
I'm a little tall. As unaccustomed as I am to public speaking, as my father would always say. Let's see if you can hear this. As you can imagine, Father driving down the road, hoorah, hoorah, having a grand old time as only Charlie Sellers can.
Our first speaker today is Waldo Martin, and Waldo is the Alexander F. and May T. Morrison Professor of American History and Citizenship here at Berkeley. He received his education from Duke University as a PA and then a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. He's taught a number of fascinating courses on the civil rights movement, African American history up to 1861, African Americans and race relations, and he has a number of wonderful publications. The Mind of Frederick Douglass, The Making of Black America, and Black Nationalism, the Third World, and the Jews. And he's the co-editor of a book called Civil Rights in the United States, an encyclopedia. Waldo.
Al Green is always worth waiting for. There you go.
What's this all about? In 1977, I passed my oldest, and I have a blowout of authority. And I remember Larry Levine, Black, but I mostly remember Charlie Sellers. Because this song came on, Al Green, Love and Happiness, and there were over 100 people there, all over the place, very hazy, very smoky, a lot of dancing, a lot of craziness. had met Charlie before at a couple of our traditional cocktail parties where I had shaken his hand and said hello, but I didn't really know Charlie. And we bonded around love and happiness that night. And from that point on, every time I saw Charlie, we always greeted one another as fellow Tar Heels. I'm glad you started with that. I don't think I've heard that since I left North Carolina. But what I think is very, very important is that he never really left. And every time we got together, I came to see him, not only as a fellow historian, but as a fellow Tar Heel, as someone who deeply identified with a place. I don't know how many Tar Heels there are in here, but one of the things I think you need to understand about North Carolina is that North Carolina sits between Virginia and South Carolina. North Carolina, as William Jordan once told me, is a valley of humility between two mountains of conceit. And I think that gives you a lot of insight into North Carolina and into Tar Heels. The other thing that we talked a lot about was music, about country music, about blues, about soul, about food, about grits, red-eye gravy, chitlins, about a whole range of issues in Southern culture. But I think we mostly bonded that evening around food. Intellectually, and as a scholar, I had met Charlie in a seminar in 1972 as a junior at Duke. I took a seminar with Robert Durden, and we read the Southern Whigs, and we read The Travail of Slavery. My memory, not too much about the Whigs. We didn't care much about then and now. But that Travail of Slavery piece has stuck with me because it was one of the first pieces that I had read by a Southern white grappling with the enduring significance of slavery, not only for Southern American identity, but for white identity. And it sticks with me to this day. Charlie. My best friend in graduate school took a couple of seminars with Charlie, so I got a lot of stories. But what I really got a sense of from Bob and Elaine was that he really listened to them, that he really heard them, and that he was a very humorous guy, and Charlie and I call it Mark's jokes, and he was fun-loving. Another way in which I came to know Charlie was through Takaki, Ronald Takaki. Takaki, a world-renowned historian, actually did his PhD here in the early 60s in Berkeley with fellows. And Takaki had very interesting stories to talk about what it was like to be an Asian American in Berkeley's history department before the age of enlightenment. And so the fact that he wrote that piece was Charlie stands out. Another way in which I interacted with Charlie, as the graduate school, is that there's the official word, there are all these things you hear, and then there's the grapevine. Okay, so the grapevine had it that Charlie was actually on the committee that read my MA exam that passed me. Thank you, Brother Charlie. Deeply invested. But where I really got to know Charlie was at Strawberry Creek College, which was a small experimental place where I really rediscovered my love for history and teaching because I'd been a TA in the department for 2 years, and teaching those, as one of my colleagues would say, the Great Unwashed in 17A, But the Strawberry Creek was very different. Peter Dale Scott, Charles Muscatine, and Charlie created an atmosphere where he not only took ideas seriously, but the idea of teaching seriously, engaging students seriously. You designed and taught your own class. These classes were team taught. The issue was enduring. The issues were typically of enduring and contemporary relevance. Issues of pedagogy were taken very seriously. And as I was putting this together, I typically sort of ran ideas by Charlie, by Peter, and by Chuck Muscatine, and they were always open and very, very helpful. In my memory bank, the very first class I taught there, Jeff Prager, who's now in sociology at UCLA, taught an amazing course with Bob Stam, who's now in NYU Film School. Another class with Michaela Leonardo, an anthropologist now in Northwestern. And so it was one of those places where very early on, team teaching, interdisciplinarity, these kinds of things were modeled. And what I don't think a lot of people understand is that Peter Dale Scott, Charles Muscatine, and Charlie Sellers were crucial to that. They also had great social events. And I don't need to go there, but let's just say we had a good time. And Charlie was all really a good time. I reconnected with Charlie intellectually when I came back to Berkeley in the 90s, and we talked a lot about market evolution because I actually taught that in the 275 or the graduate seminar for the first year graduate students. And what I really came to appreciate was not only Charlie as a researcher and a writer, but someone who was constantly thinking and rethinking what he had already done. And so we had many interesting conversations around that. I didn't really know about Charlie's civil rights activism until much later. I bought his book, and this is Charlie. And so talked a lot about that, what that was like, especially being in Berkeley. Berkeley's poor, Congress of racial equality. But the thing that I most remember about Charlie, the brother was cool. Every time I was with Charlie, I had a good time. We would sit out, we had a couple of meals with Carolyn, Catherine, and I, or Charlie and I would just sit out and talk. And what I mostly remember is how comfortable I felt around him. I think it had something to do with my mother being from a little place not that far from where he grew up. And I had that whole rural thing from the beginning. Another thing that I really enjoyed about Charlie was he loved to tell stories, he loved to swap tales, and a lot of them about his family, a lot of them about his kids, a lot of them about the various travels and trips, and we always had a lot of time. All of the good times doing that kind of thing. We also lamented the reptilian nature of politics in North Carolina. But what I want to leave you with is that Charlie was a character. And I think it's because, I think, I want to sort of Rihanna, it's the characters in your life that really stand out. And Charlie was a character. But I would leave you with a term that we would use in North Carolina. Charlie was a hoot. And if you don't know who, you didn't Google it. But he was a hoot. I want to thank you, Charlie, for those precious memories. May your powerful legacy live on. And to Charlie, to Carolyn, and the family, I want to always wish you love and happiness.
Brian DeLay of the University of California History Department. Brian received his PhD from Harvard in 2004. He taught at the University of Colorado Boulder, taking then a position at UC Berkeley. He's the author of a U.S. history book on experience history, and then a 2008 book, War of a Thousand Deserts, Indian Raids, and the U.S.-Mexican War, which won prizes from several scholarly organizations. Brian has served as a Fulbright Distinguished Lecturer. He's received fellowships from the ACLS, American Philosophical Science Society, the Guggenheim Foundation, and other organizations. I'd like to welcome Brian DeLay.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor and a privilege to be here and speak with you today. It's a little bit hard after Waldo and Al Green, and Tom pointed out that Charlie would have objected my tie, so I'm a little off my game to start off with, but I'm going to do my best. I first met Charlie in 2013. I had sent him an email, basically a fan letter, and he kindly invited me to come over to his house, and I was mentally thinking through all the different historical topics I wanted to talk to him about. And I got there, and he indulged me for a little while, but it became clear that he wasn't all that interested in talking about the history that I wanted to talk about. He wanted to talk about birds. And that was surprising, but it's fine by me because I also love birds. And so we spent a long time talking about birding around the area. He showed me these beautiful photographs, and especially what I remember most is he shared with me stories of he and Carolyn driving over North America in a camper, chasing birds, taking photographs, Charlie processing photographs in the afternoon, while Carolyn wrote her papers on the desk. And for me, I think especially at the end of the semesters, it seems like a little vision of paradise. So at night, I find myself Googling campers, how much are these things, so I owe him that as well. But the truth is, I didn't know Charlie remotely as well as most of you knew him. And when I spoke to Carolyn about what I might be able to contribute, she asked me to speak personally about how his work has influenced me. So that's what I'm going to try to do. And I hope that these reflections can offer a glimpse to the rest of you for whom Charlie was a beloved family member, a colleague, a friend, a teacher, how he influenced people that I've never met, and people that hardly think like me. Charlie's books belong in a very special shelf in my collection, books that collectively taught me something more important than history, taught me something essential about the enterprise of history, about the discipline that I was embarking on and that I've tried to devote my career to. His books taught me something about where the bar is, or where it's supposed to be. And I'm going to try to share 3 of the things I think I've learned from Charlie over the years. First, he helped me understand some of the qualities that go into enduring work. The wonderful celebrations of his career that I know you've all seen that have come out since his passing, understandably focused on market revolution. So for this first lesson, I'm going to focus instead on his great biography of James A. Polk. As Carolyn said, my dissertation, my first book was about the U.S.-Mexican War. And dealing with that topic meant that I had to have Charlie's biography of Polk near at hand pretty much the whole process. The first volume of this series appeared in 1957, the second appeared in 1966. I started my dissertation work in 1998. And then, more than 40 years after the first volume appeared, it was still beyond question that it had to start with that book. Nothing had come remotely close to it by then.
Professional historians these days, of course, do not hold presidential biography in the highest place of esteem in terms of what historians, academic historians do. Partly that's because the public still loves presidential biography, and that makes us irritated and jealous. Partly it's because of a skepticism about the implication behind the phrase for presidential biography, which is that presidents have the power to shape the destiny of the country at these critical moments of historical juncture, especially during wartime. And I think that most historians who looked at presidents in these moments of crisis have determined, in fact, that their actions were highly constrained by a whole host of circumstances, structures, relationships, and they simply didn't have the latitude to shape destiny in a way that most of the public seems to think they did. So that's another reason for skepticism about the donor. And I think that's basically true, but it's not true with James A. Polk. Polk was elected president in 1844, and if that had not happened, we wouldn't have went to war with Mexico. If we had not gone to war with Mexico, the future of North America would have been radically different. Polk was barely elected president in 1844. Almost didn't happen. So in order to understand the transformations that remade Mexico the United States, the future of the United States as a world power, you have to grapple with Polk as an individual, as a political creature, and with the context from which he emerged. And that requires a truly magnificent, exhaustive, authoritative biography. And we have one, and it's one that Charles Sellers wrote quite a long time ago now. So what makes it so enduring and so great? Well, first, of course, there is its careful, tireless, and I think, frankly, unsurpassable research into Polk, into his times, into his circles. Charlie just read everything. And moreover, into the decades since, as historians like me have gone and followed up his citations for more information, we find again and again and again that Charlie got it right. So it is exhaustive and authoritative at the same time. Then, of course, there's Charlie's enviable prose style. And all know exactly what I'm talking about here. Succinct, sharp, knowing, often funny, sometimes cutting. And he has a remarkable ability to evoke complex, realized, memorable characters in just a few wonderful sentences. But of all, I think that these two books endure even more than their unsurpassed research and the amazing prose style. I think they endure because of the analysis. They endure because the picture that they present to Polk is just so compelling. It's just so convincing. Charlie evoked the sources of and the manifestations of Polk's hunger and his ambition, his insecurity, his remarkable political gifts, undeniable political gifts, his formidable capacity for deceit of others and of himself, his almost maniacal single-mindedness as a political actor, and crucially, his utter incapacity to grasp the fact that his nationalistic war upon Mexico was going to tear the United States apart. And that's where the second volume of biography ends. As Charlie puts it at the end of that book, quote, Polk was not remotely equipped to understand the emotions men brought to the emerging slavery controversy. Even to ask whether this rapidly industrializing, urbanizing nation could remain half slave and half free seemed to him wildly irresponsible and unpatriotic. Men who could not accept the time-honored compromises that had guaranteed his old republic simply dismayed and perplexed him. So Charlie presents us with a figure who was at once transformative of his times and catastrophically out of step with his times. And after you've read more than 1,000 pages of biography, you were thoroughly convinced by his interpretation. So the first big lesson that I took away from Charlie's work was about the kind of research, the kind of writing, the kind of analysis that makes for enduring work. And that's one reason I'm using that. The second lesson that I took away from his work is that Charlie helped me see that great historians take risks. At the end of Volume 2, Polk had instigated his war with Mexico. He had brilliantly manipulated most of Washington into legitimating that war. He often against their better judgment, and it seemed, at that moment when the book ends, that all that remains, Charlie tells us on the final page of the book, was, quote, the grubby task of bludgeoning and riding the Mexicans into peace. The profession had showered praise on these books, and as Harold mentioned, the second volume will bankrupt. Therefore, many prominent people in the field were, like James K. Polk, baffled and dismayed when Charlie decided not to write that second book, or pardon, that third book. It was intended to be a trilogy, everyone expected it to be a trilogy, they were eagerly awaiting the conclusion of the trilogy, and Charlie decided not to do it. I've heard prominent historians sincerely characterize this decision as a tragedy. A tragedy that this book was never finished. And as someone who relied so heavily on the first two volumes of the book and learned so much from them, I agreed with this conclusion. But I have since changed my mind about that. Charlie spent several years doing the research and thinking necessary for that third volume, and he gave copious notes to my friend and colleague Amy Greenberg, who was testifying to a remarkable amount of work he put into that volume that he finished. But I think that Charlie came to the conclusion that he had already answered the big question. And that what remained was basically the grubby task of just finishing it up. And that didn't inspire him. So he decided that his time, his talents, and his passion, that's a crucial part of the story, his passion, would be better put to use undertaking a bold, big, new project. Now, that doesn't seem like such a risk from our perspective now, because we know, of course, that that bold, big, new project was going to be his magnum opus. But he couldn't have known that at the time. I think it's instructive just to try to put ourselves in his position, right? When he had done all this work, and the profession, I'm sure, every professional conference he ever went to, people were like, oh, when is it coming? I can't wait. When are we going to finish this book? That he, in that context, not knowing what was going to happen with this idea that he was beginning to formulate about an alternative book, that he decides to turn away from his years of work and from the expectations of most colleagues in the field in order to take the leap into the dark. Leave this great work, the work that had defined his professional reputation at that point, leave it unfinished in order to do something new and important. So I reflect on this from time to time. I mean, in my own career, I've moved in directions that I hadn't anticipated before, as I think all of us have. And as I've gone in these new directions and acquired new interests and priorities and changed course from what I had intended, I think about Charlie, and I think about the courage that it took for him to do what he did, and how glad I am that he made that decision. So, the third big thing that I learned from Charlie's work is that great books arise from the combination of expertise and conviction. Expertise and conviction. The great labor that goes into acquiring expertise, and the humility about the limits of what we know, what we can know, that fuels that great labor, can inhibit experts from venturing bold conclusions with conviction. And of course, I think that that is true of most academic history, most of the history that our profession falls into that domain. There's expertise, clear expertise in the work, and then relatively narrow conclusions. And there's something important, I suppose, about that impulse. On the other end of the spectrum, so much of our culture, I think especially today, maybe more than ever in my lifetime at any rate, encourages and rewards conviction without expertise. So we've got plenty of that. And sometimes you can see that in academic writing as well. And that is not compelling. But the market revolution is to combine unarguable command over the primary and the secondary literature with a bracing, far-seeing, courageous conviction of argument. And that's, I think, what made it such a special book. Consider this small sample of positions that Charlie takes just in the first chapter of that book. And reflect on the way in which he sometimes is cramming 2-3 huge arguments into a single sentence here. He says, for example, that, quote, contrary to liberal mythology, democracy was born in tension with with capitalism and not as its natural and legitimizing political expression. Or that the economic boom following the War of 1812, quote, ignited a generation of conflict over the republic's destiny. Something you typically hear academic historians say. History's most revolutionary force, he tells us, the capitalist market, was wresting the American future from history's most conservative force, the land. An interesting sentence. That, quote, irony compounded tragedy as a doomed white culture sustained itself for a few generations longer and cleared the American land for market domination by sweeping away a more archaic Indian culture. Or that, quote, commercial boom made government promotion of economic growth the central dynamic of American politics. That the noble struggle against the market revolution, what Charlie tells us, is, quote, the climactic struggle over American destiny, would be hobbled by unresolved tensions within that oppositional coalition. Tensions between equality and opportunity, between rural egalitarianism and commitment to private property, and between democracy and white supremacy. That, quote, establishing capitalist hegemony over economy, politics, and culture, the market created ourselves and most of the world as we know it. Finally, of course, there's Charlie's conclusion, evident throughout the furious and beautiful book that is The Market Revolution, that the triumph of the market revolution was a world historic tragedy. Now, the market revolution was the first book that I ever encountered that had the power to make one of my professors visibly angry. And that was really interesting to me. As a person who came from a pretty apolitical household, who came late to history in college, I felt like I understood something about the analytic problems that historians are supposed to be wrestling with. I understood something about history as a literary enterprise, but I struggled to grasp the degree to which politics seemed to animate and throb beneath the surface of some of these histories. And this is something that the more sophisticated peers seem to understand easily than all my professors seem to understand. And the Market Revolution was the first book where I felt like I was beginning to understand this. And so it played a really important role for me in that way as well. Charlie's expertise, the undeniable fact that he was among a handful of people in the whole country who understood this era best, and who was in most complete command of its historiography and its source material. I think these facts helped to make this book's arguments so exhilarating and inspirational to some, and so maddening to many others. Charlie mobilized a career's worth of expertise to climb as high as he could, and then to shout the truth as he saw it in this strident, powerful language. It wasn't exactly my truth. It might not be your truth, but the devotion that earned him that expertise, and the vision and the courage that enabled him to write his big truths with conviction, these are virtues that I think we all can aspire to. And I certainly am grateful for the example. Thank you.
Appreciate your wonderful comments. Our next speaker is Daniel Bulata, and Daniel Bulata is a historian of religion. He's interested in the history of North American Christianity and of biblical interpretation. He's a Doctor of Philosophy candidate in religious studies at Stanford University. His scholarship, for the most part, is focused on 18th and 19th century American Christianity. And he is doing absolutely wonderful work. He participated in a discussion group that we held at the Belmont Senior Living with wonderful, very insightful comments. He's a graduate of Yale University's Divinity School and has a bachelor's degree in theology with honors from the University of Newcastle. He received his undergraduate degree in bachelor's degree in theology through Charles Stewart University. Daniel, thank you.
Thank you. As a younger scholar, I must say this is my first memorial for a friend and academic, and it's very suitable that an academic memorial we have we're hearing about what the books people have published, so it's going to get their sales going. Wonderful mini lectures about James K. Polk, and it's beautifully appropriate for an academic memorial. So it's lovely to see. Even beyond people are still talking about each other's work and trying to make their own. And I must say, I do feel like I'm somewhat in hostile territory, as Charlie would often remind me as a Yale graduate. He was very proud of being a Harvard man, although he would often joke that you can always tell a Harvard man, just not much. And as a Stanfordite, he was very proud of the Berkeley affiliation, and he would never let me forget that I was crossing over the frontier into hostile territory. So it was wonderful. My memories, I've been very fortunate to know Charlie as a friend in the final years of his life. But before I met Charlie, the man, I met the caricature, the footnotes, and the summary. At Yale, I was fortunate enough to take a history seminar with David Blight, and he divided the class into 3 groups. One group had to read Daniel Walker Howe's What Hath God Wrought. One group had to read Sean Lewentz's Rise of American Democracy, and one group had to read Charles Sellers' The Market Revolution. I did not read The Market Revolution. I read Sean Lewentz's Rise of American Democracy. So you can imagine my surprise when I was listening to the group summarize the arguments, how on earth we went from Andrew Jackson's bank war to Methodist masturbation habits in antebellum America was quite mind-boggling for me in 2016. So I was not sure what to make of this book I had not read and was hearing all about it. Suffice to say, I was very skeptical because the way the book was presented to me, Charlie was falling into the category of blame capitalism for everything, which at that point in 2016, you can imagine as a graduate student, I had heard the story before, and I was getting a little bored of it. But then, when I came to Stanford, in Jim Campbell's history seminar, he made us all read The Market Revolution. So I got to read it again, if you will, for the first time. And it was a wonderful experience. I very much enjoyed it, as much as I had my problems with it, like a good graduate student does with every single book. But before I tried, I'm one of those people who I enjoy meeting senior scholars, and much like Brian just mentioned, thinking you're going to have, as a young scholar, thinking you're going to have these intellectual clashes, and they're going to enrich your scholarship, and usually they want to talk about something else. But I had emailed Charlie, and I got no response for a year. I figured, well, he's retired. Who knows? He made big time to me. Who wants to talk to this, whatsoever? This no-name graduate student at Stanford bothering him. But then Jim, Dr. Campbell, a year later, pointed something out to me that created the key for me to get to Charlie's living room to have coffee with him. He pointed out to me the delicious point that the very first person he cites in The Market Revolution as the kind of anchor for so much of his scholarship was his wife, Carolyn Merchant. That gave me the idea to email Carolyn. So I emailed Carolyn. Carolyn invited me over, and soon enough I was meeting the man, the myth, the legend, Charles Sellers. He was not interested in listening to me that much about my dissertation, about the rise of Andrew Jackson and religious politics. He wanted to talk about birds. There's a theme. He was more interested in my accents and as an Australian than he was in much of my work, and wanted to tell me all about his time chasing kangaroos and emus and all the wonderful Australian birds that he wanted to know if I had seen or not. he was very disappointed I had not seen any of them. But then, I did enjoy this experience, and I told him about the podcast I have organized, and a session in the podcast. Every once in a while, I host an episode called History of History, where I talk about famous books. We had just talked about the market revolution, and he listened to it, and he enjoyed it. And I noticed that Lowentz's Rise of American Democracy was becoming an audiobook. Howe's book was an audiobook. I said, hey, Charlie, I know how to do audiobooks. Why don't we turn the market revolution into an audiobook? And we did. It took 6 months, so it's a big book. But we got there. And then we did the Pulp series, and I was able to turn them into audiobooks, and it was a wonderful experience. And in that time, I got to know Charlie, hanging out with him, having coffee, and in a strange way, I think I became Charlie's last TA, in a sense, at the retirement village, and was able to pass out notes and on my spare time at the retirement village. But it was wonderful. He did fulfill my fantasies in any way. He did want to read my conference papers. He did want to read things I'd written. And at his age, even though he had lost many of his speech ability, his writing and comments on my work were still sharp as they ever were, telling me things I had missed, points of disagreement, and even though my dissertation was in its embryonic stage at that stage, automatically he was having an influence on me. And when I invited Dr. Lowentz at Princeton to be on my committee and he agreed, Charlie was over the moon and, in a sense, felt that he was there in spirit in many ways. And that was very, very humbling. But being connected to Twitter and social media, I started telling people I was hanging out with Charles Sellers. And the floodgates opened with former students, undergraduate students, graduate students who had met him. And I got all sorts of bizarre questions. Does he still live on a boat? Is he still doing the caravan thing? And what on earth is going on? And I heard all these wonderful stories from friends and peers, and even Charlie's fiercest critics would tell me wonderful stories about his personality. And in a sense, the kind of old guard would lament that they could have these bitter, I disagreed with every single iota Charles Sellers ever wrote, but he was fun to hang out with. In a sense, they could lament that perhaps the Academy is not as congenial to that sort of environment as it used to be. I pray not, but we'll see. Gotta get a job first, anyway. The last years of Charlie showed me how much of a legacy he still had, that the caricature was not real, and one of the last things I asked Charlie, funnily enough, is I asked him if he had any regrets of people he hadn't met or hadn't interacted with. And at the time, he was rereading so many of his undergraduate books he had read as an undergraduate. And he was reading Age of Jackson by Arthur Schlesinger Jr., and a book that had influenced both of us. And he told me that he had several opportunities to meet Schlesinger, but he never did. And he felt sad about that. And it was in that moment I felt very blessed that I had met Charles Sellers, even for a brief moment. And even today, sort of being his social media liaisons on the outside, letting people know, going to the James K. Polk conference and hearing all these wonderful stories about Charlie. Everybody had some kind of opinion, and the Polk people wanted me to tell you that they knew Charlie was cool before the market revolution, so they wanted me to let you guys know that. But I will miss Charlie. I will miss his humor. I will miss a mentor I had for a brief moment, and the market revolution endures, Polk endures, and his personality and legacy endures, and he will be missed.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Peter Dale Scott. Peter Scott served for many years in the English department at UC Berkeley, and Peter and Charlie were colleagues going way back to the free speech movement on Sproul Plaza when Charlie was marching with the students in the circle. And one of Charlie's history colleagues said, "Charlie, what are you doing in there?" And he said, "Waldo," meaning Thoreau, talking to Ralph Waldo, "what are you doing out there?" And Peter and Charlie worked for many years together in the free speech movement at Berkeley, and had numerous radical conversations together. And then the major place where I got to know Peter was through Strawberry Creek College, which he and Charlie and Charles Muscatine founded at UC Berkeley. And it was a great program for students to have 12 units in a single course with a professor and a graduate student. And then they would take one course outside in the real world campus. But Strawberry Creek College was a wonderful institution and a wonderful event. It did not last because Berkeley wasn't ready to take on that kind of radical education. But anyway, I'd like to introduce Peter Dale Scott. Thank you.
First of all, my condolences to Carolyn and the Sellers family, and also my thanks to them for arranging this much-needed, I believe, event. Charles was an amazing man in so many ways that an hour is not nearly enough to do him justice. Let me begin with the day of July 21st, 1961, when 9 people got off a plane in Jackson, Mississippi to join the Freedom Riders there. And one of them, as I hope you know, was Charlie. As they expected, they were not greeted with dogs, billy clubs, and TV cameras. They were simply arrested, booked, and imprisoned. Well, that sounds simple enough, but the 9 men already knew what risked happening to them, which they had heard from their African-American comrades in CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. Namely, that the city of Jackson had developed a new strategy to avoid being watched on TV, which was to do their dirty work behind closed doors. And now what follows is a quote. Behind closed doors, the prisoners were tortured with electric cattle prods and wrist breakers, burned with cigarettes, sprayed with fire hoses, and then blasted with industrial-sized fans for up to 24 hours at a time. That's what Charlie knew was possibly ahead of him. And that's why it was so important that whites joined blacks in their struggle for freedom, for that is what made the civil rights movement a national movement, and ultimately, after the deaths of whites as well as blacks, a successful one. Charlie did not just teach history. At great personal risk, he helped make it, as part of a movement that helped change America and indeed the world. Not by might nor by power, but by spirit, said an angel to the prophet Zechariah. Might was defeated by spirit in Mississippi, as it would be a few years later in Poland and then in all Eastern Europe. And I think one of the major causes for hope in this somewhat depressing time is that spirit has conquered power in more places and in more ways than ever before in time. And I do believe that the true history of human beings is the history of spirit, and that the history of power and the history of might has been a diversion that we spent too much time focusing on. And I think that the Marxist revolution, I think it even more hearing whoever it was talking about the conviction that matched the scholarship. I see that book as a history of spirit. Charlie helped change both the university and the city of Berkeley as well. The history of the free speech movement, or FSM, began when the Chancellor of UC closed down a core table that was mobilizing for a civil rights protest in a local Lucky supermarket. Thus, it was no accident that Charlie, a core member, was the first faculty member to speak from the rooftop of the police car with his colleague Jack Weinberg inside, and with more than 1,000 students outside, preventing that police car from going anywhere. The FSM protest came to a head on December the 3rd, 1964, when 800 students were arrested in the city in Sparrow Hall. That night, Charlie was in a queue of professors lined up at the Berkeley jail to bail out their students. There he met for the first time Charles Muscatine, a veteran of Berkeley's oath controversy in the 1950s. The two men organized what was originally known as the Sellers Committee, 7 professors meeting in Charlie's office. They in turn organized a larger faculty group, the so-called Committee of 200, who drafted a motion supporting an acceptable version of the students' free speech demands. This motion, when it was adopted by the Berkeley Academic Senate, ended the weeks of turmoil on the UCB campus. All through the years of the anti-war movement, which soon ensued, this faculty-student alliance against higher power continued to distinguish Berkeley from other great Eastern campuses like Harvard, Yale, and Columbia. There, the faculty and students were so often bitterly fighting each other. As the Vietnam War grew more intense, this congressional district continued for a while to be represented by a pro-war Democrat with a Union background, Jeffrey Cohalan. He had been elected in the 1950s with support from another liberal faculty coalition. But in 1969, Charlie collaborated successfully with his friends in the Berkeley Democratic Black Caucus to nominate and elect Ron Dellums, a declared socialist, to Congress. The Dellums politics in Congress endures to this day in the presence of on the person of his former aide and successor, Barbara Lee, the only person in Congress to vote against the ill-advised U.S. invasion of Iraq. Having done more than his share to change history, Charlie also mounted a significant challenge to the teaching of American history with his landmark book, The Market Revolution, Jacksonian America, 1815 to 1846. Whereas previous historians had portrayed the Jacksonian era as one of happy progress with capitalism and democracy supporting and nurturing each other, Charlie, in a darker and more dialectical analysis, argued that democracy in the U.S. was not strengthened by capitalism, but resisted and was diminished by it. Well, I'm not a professional historian. I'm so glad to have heard the two speakers ahead of me. I just want to add that as a Canadian poet, obsessed by my love-hate relationship with America, I would like to suggest that we will not understand the energies dividing this country today until we recognize that the dialectical process Charlie described is still with us, and it will continue to be with us until many more well-educated Americans do what Charlie did and risk our bodies when called upon in the cause of freedom, equality, and justice. Because I only had 10 minutes, I wasn't going to talk about Strawberry Creek College, but it was very well handled by Waldo. That's where I met Carolyn for the first time. I just will say that it was great for the students, but it was great for me as a teacher, because I got to do for the first time which I'd always wanted to do but had no qualifications to do whatsoever, and that was teach Virgil. And I taught Virgil in a class with a Mexican American, and we had a curriculum that started with Virgil and went on to many books, including Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and 100 Años de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And that got me starting for the first time writing what I consider to be histories of spirit, which I've been doing ever since. Two big books not yet published. I would have loved to have said here more about Charlie as a friend, the excitement of watching stage grouse at 1 in the morning when they're puffing their chests and strutting and fanning their tails in their mating dance, or the excitement of riding in a Jeep with Carolyn down a narrow, dry ravine into Antelope Valley and seeing a garden of flowers which went on for miles and miles after a heavy desert rainstorm. But Charlie needs to be remembered as more than a friend. He was a model for what educated Americans can do if they care deeply, for what this country is supposed to stand for. Not just to study history, but engage in it, work to heal it, and if necessary, risk your life for it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you all for your wonderful talks about Charlie. He was my beloved, and I miss him terribly. But we had almost 50 years together, and I don't know that anyone could ask for more than that with a wonderful, absolutely brilliant, exciting, adventuresome human being. So now I'd like to ask people if they would like to stand up, if anyone, and make a few brief remarks about their memories of Charlie. And Steve, would you like to come up and also moderate this portion of the event? Thanks so much.
So much you learn about your father. So much you already know. Perhaps so much you don't even know about my father. When attending Harvard, as I'm told by my father, he used to go down to New York, to Harlem, and listen to a young preacher on the corner. Anybody want to hazard a guess who that young preacher became? Malcolm X. Became a good friend of my father's. Spurred his continued passion for equal rights in this United States. I have, we heard earlier, so eloquently put about my father's crusade to help elect Congressman Ron Dellums. I was there for every speech with Ron Dellums. I thought of him as a master orator myself. He was one of my first mentors in watching how it was done right in this world in politics. And I have the telegram when we were in England that was sent to me, to my father and my mother, announcing, "We won." for Congressman Ron Dellums. I still have that telegram. I have the memory of lying on a lawn, spelling out with human bodies the word pig for the National Guards to fly over and see us so eloquently naming themselves during the Vietnam era protests here in Berkeley. My mother and my father were married prior to Carolyn, and we lived in a house where the People's Park is. Most people refer to as the People's Park. It was started off as the People's Park because the park belonged to the people. It was supposed to be multi-unit housing for the UC Berkeley people, but it was torn down and we took it over for the people. And those trees, I remember the day that those trees were delivered by the people and planted, those trees that stand so very tall today. My father's been an earmark and a part of UC Berkeley history beyond what we can even imagine, beyond even what we can fathom. I remember that my father ran for city council in the far-right liberal extreme section of the hills here in Berkeley, because there's not really a Republican Party in Berkeley, but it's as far right as you can get into the liberal spectrum of things. And of course he lost, but did you know who his campaign manager was? Wavy Gravy. It was the same year that Wavy Gravy flavor came out for Ben & Jerry's. I was there when Wavy Gravy brought the pint over. I invited Wavy Gravy to join us today. I could not get him to join us, unfortunately. So there's so many things about my father that should not pass through our hands, but we should allow them and join them at the end of this ceremony when we congregate. Let's talk amongst each other and remind each other of the eloquence and the brilliance and truly the spirit that he brought to this world. I'm overwhelmed by being his son. I am supposed to say a few words on behalf of his sister-in-law, Carolyn's sister, Ann Bosgard. Charlie, a remembrance by his sister-in-law, Ann Merchant Bosgard. Charlie. He brought my sister happiness. He was always so supportive of her and so positive about her and her various undertakings, and she herself became a more positive person too. He was her intellectual companion in so many ways. They enjoyed and shared each other's academic undertakings and successes. UC Berkeley Strawberry Creek College, started in 1974, was one of those. Carolyn and Charles were both involved in this experimental and interdisciplinary program. I would mention their common political alignment and various political actions too. Was she not his campaign manager to run Berkeley Council? She was as well. They shared so many interests, including some that he introduced to her. I'm thinking particularly about bird watching and sailing. Bird watching was our lives growing up. I remember as a child thinking, I really want to go to Six Flags. Wouldn't that be fun? Where are we going? Point raised. I do not look back without complete fondness for being raised that way. My children have been raised in that manner as well, and they are appreciative of that. We learned to honor bird watching in our environment at an early age, and that is passed down. And goes on to say, both of these, bird watching and sailing, both of these took them all over the country, all over Mexico, all over
The Arctic.
Australia, the Arctic. Where didn't they go? I mean, really, let's think about that. That camper and that boat saw many, many miles. Both of these took them all traveling along the intracoastal highways, and some by camper van. They experienced a memorable extended period in Australia as well. They were both busy writing books while on these expeditions. I'm so grateful to Charlie for all the emotional and intellectual joy he brought to my sister. Sincerely, Ann Bosgard. And Ann is joining us by phone, so we can say hello to Ann.
Hi, Ann.
anybody like to speak on Charlie's spirit? Please. Come on. No one is as loud as I.
So my name is Tom Reifer, and I teach sociology at the University of San Diego. And I actually was turned on to the work of Charlie Sellers by a big fan of his, and Noam Chomsky. And but I realized coming to this memorial service about various things that bring us together. So I was born in Spanish Harlem, and I didn't know what happened to my parents because I was abandoned at 18 months old, and so I was always reading books about Harlem. I read the autobiography of Malcolm X. Later I went to a school for, which was started by the professors who were part of the ad hoc faculty committee at Columbia University, Emmanuel Wallerstein and Terrence Hopkins, later joined by Giovanni Arrighi. But most significantly, and I'm a big fan of Charlie's work and got a chance to talk to him and meet him later on. And actually, Charlie and Carolyn came to I think the 30th anniversary of the first day I met Daniel Ellsberg when he was teaching at UC Irvine in 1984. So that was a wonderful event. But one of the reasons I wanted to come up is because Charlie's spirit and that of the original Freedom Riders live on. I work with a group called the Freedom Riders Foundation. You may have seen the film with Hilary Swank and the documentary. There's a Freedom Riders Diary, and actually we're publishing a new book called Dear Freedom Rider, Stories from the Second Generation. So the thing that means most to me about Charlie's work is the movements. It was that type of movement that rescued me as a runaway street kid in Orange County, and strangely enough, though I never graduated from high school, led me to go on and to be a scholar and activist in the tradition of Charlie. And it's that spirit that we really need today. I assign Charlie's Market Revolution every time I teach political sociology. It's the first book that they read, and I put Charlie on all my exams for this semester to talk about his life of scholarship and activism. So love to Carolyn and the family and Charlie. May we pick up the baton of the Freedom Riders and Charlie's work, like the Freedom Riders today, and create a better world. Thank you.
Anybody else care to share? First David, then you, Bert.
Hi, my name's Dave Iltis. I'm Carolyn's son, and we grew up some of the time with Charlie. My brother John and I, we spent much of that time in Wisconsin with my father, but Charlie had a huge impact on our life. Particularly, I'd echo what Steen said, which is we went bird watching a lot, camping, and yeah, Charlie taught us about bird watching and sailing on the Storm Petrel on the San Francisco Bay to Sausalito and Angel Island, and we had overheard many of the intellectual conversations. Charlie was a great friend, companion and partner to my mom, and helped her greatly, I think, in writing her books. She's told me that he helped with the first sentence of the Death of Nature, my mom's great work on the change in how people viewed nature starting in the 1600s-ish or so, correct? Anyway,
that sentence was,
you'll have to say that.
the world we have lost was organic.
So in regards to the free speech movement, I didn't know a lot about this until fairly recently, reading through Charlie's memoirs, which there are copies of this out in his own words that tell about his life. But I stumbled across just a day or so ago a writing from the Online Archive of California that Charlie had written regarding the free speech movement. I think this is actually the letter written to the community and to the University of California regarding the events of how the faculty began to support the free speech movement from the faculty side and supported the students' activities so that the students weren't so isolated as one of the previous speakers said that they were in other universities. And I'm just going to read the first and last paragraph of this. It's 3 or so long pages. But the turbulent events on the Berkeley campus of the University of California have been deeply disturbing to the people of the state. The day-to-day reports by press, radio, and television could have hardly conveyed a clear understanding of an extremely tangled situation. Consequently, many friends of the university have been puzzled by the erroneous impression that a distinguished faculty is supporting a riotous and irresponsible group of students. What follows is an effort to interpret the situation as we believe it is viewed by a majority of the Berkeley faculty. So he goes on to explain a lot of that interpretation and the conclusions that the faculty come to and what they asked of the administration. He concludes by saying these recommendations were adopted because they seem to an overwhelming majority of the Berkeley faculty both proper in themselves and indispensable to the restoration of our sheltered university community. They reflect the conclusions to which we have come all too belatedly and out of costly experience. Their successful implementation and the survival of our campus unimpaired will require the sympathetic understanding and support of regents, administrators, our colleagues on the other campuses of the university, and the troubled friends of the university throughout the state and the country. Charles Sellers, Professor of History, Berkeley. And then lastly, this is something that's been posted on the refrigerator, on the walls at the Rose Street house where my mom and Charlie spent a number of years recently. My mom has lived there since 1967. These are Sellers' sayings on how to make it through life. 1, and this too shall pass away. 2, into every life a little rain must fall. 3, we all have our cross to bear. 4, the world's work must go on. 5, time wounds all heals. 6, that's the way she wants it. And the she, I'm pretty sure, refers to my mother. 7, courage, my love. 8, put not thy faith in institutions. 9, one that I and my partner Lisa, my fiancée Lisa, repeat. Life sure is rough under capitalism. And 10, it's never too soon to start writing. Thank you, Charlie. We'll miss you.
Let's hear from my older brother, Greer Sellers. Dr. Greer Sellers.
Well, one of the many wonderful things about growing up with my dad as a father, one in particular that I remember was back when we were small, every Saturday, or sometimes every Sunday, but every weekend, we would go on what we called an expedition. And this meant that we would go to some wild place. It might be, as Steve mentioned, up at Point Reyes. It might be some other place in Marin County. It might be along the shore to look at shorebirds. But we would go on some kind of expedition. And years later, of course, when he got a sailboat, and also including steam too at that point, it would also mean going sailing. But one thing I remember in particular, in these early expeditions that he and my sister and I would go on, we would go off the beaten path into wild areas, away from trails, and we would often, I remember one time in particular, when we were walking in a forest that we had gotten into by crawling underneath a barbed wire fence. And this forest was, the floor of it was covered with leaves, and so if you walked on the leaves, it made a lot of noise, at least the way I was walking on leaves. And my father taught me, he said, well, no, you don't walk on the leaves like that. You walk very carefully with your toes forward so you won't make all this noise. And I think he didn't want to disturb the birds, drive away the birds that he was looking for. But what this taught me was, and what all these expeditions taught me was a whole attitude toward looking at nature and listening to nature that I had missed before. That I needed to be quiet and just listen to see the birds, to see whatever was there. And that was an incredible teaching to me that I took to heart in many other areas of my life. So I just wanted to share this thought and experience with you. So anyway, thank you very much, Dad, for this and so many other things.
Anybody else before we wrap this up? There'll be plenty of time afterwards to hang out and share the spirit that is my father, Charlie Sellers. On behalf of Carolyn, I want to thank you. I will speak for my brothers and sisters, my family, for taking such great care of my father during his final years. Especially the amount of devotion that it takes for caretaking is above and beyond what you can do to recognize. It is truly a work of love. And she gave every ounce of her love in his final years, his final days, his final weeks. It was remarkable to watch the amount of compassion and love she brought for my father. And that speaks to their love and enduring love throughout the ages. And God bless you. We love you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for making this wonderful, wonderful tribute to our fathers and a wonderful tribute to Charlie. Thank you all for speaking today and taking the time out of your busy lives for traveling this far to come to hear your amazing tributes and stories. And I look forward to speaking to each and every one of you after the project.
Thank you, everybody, for coming and for your tributes and for listening. And Charlie, we love you.